All right. I'm going to get started here. So welcome, everyone. We're glad to have you all here. Welcome to the LiveMove Speaker Series featuring Tamika Butler, our first one of the year. The title of this one is The Intersection of Racism and Transportation. I am John Larson Friend. I'm the Speaker Series Coordinator for LiveMove and a second-year master's student at the Community and Regional Planning Program at the University of Oregon. First of all, we're going to do a couple thank yous to some organizations supporting this event. Thank you to the Sustainable Cities Institute, the City of Eugene, the City of Springfield, University of Oregon and the School of Planning, Public Policy and Management, and the National Institute for Transportation and Communities. Specifically, we'd also like to thank Mark Schlossberg, our faculty advisor, and Marcia Graveson, who has helped us a ton in putting this together. I do want to point out that the Q&A chat is open. Should questions arise, we will have the opportunity towards the end to answer some questions. So a little bit about LiveMove. LiveMove is an organization made up of undergrad and graduate students at the University of Oregon that works to promote healthy, sustainable communities by integrating transportation and livability through collaboration, education, research, and outreach. We have weekly meetings throughout the year. Each year we do a large by design project and some smaller projects as well. In fact, the new 13th Street Bikeway that just opened in Eugene was originally a LiveMove by design project done about 7 years or so ago. When the new leadership team was elected this spring, one of the first things we discussed was speaker series. We thought, this is 2020, we all live on Zoom. Why not try to aim for some great speakers this year? That being said, we are so lucky to have with us today Tamika Butler. A little bit about her before we get started. Tamika is a national expert and speaker on issues related to the built environment, equity, anti-racism, diversity and inclusion, organizational behavior, and change management. She's an experienced planner, lawyer, nonprofit director, and consultant. So please help us welcome Tamika Butler.
Thanks so much for having me, John, and everybody. I'm super excited to be here. The chat is live, and I always like to ask folks if you can change it to panelists and attendees. It really helps me, especially because I can't see you all. If folks can just share your name and where you're zooming in from. And if that is, if you happen to know whose land you're on. I'm on stolen Tongva land here in LA. Share that, but also just share why you tuned in tonight, and don't hesitate to use the chat liberally throughout the time I'm talking, because like I said, when you can't see folks, knowing that there's an active chat going at least makes you feel like people are paying attention and like you aren't talking to yourself. And so to the extent folks feel comfortable doing that, please definitely don't hesitate to use the chat liberally. So with that, I'm gonna share my screen. I always like to preface it by saying, if you've heard me talk recently, some of this is gonna feel really redundant, not because I'm lazy, but because I have a philosophy that often when I'm speaking, I say the same thing over and over again, especially in for a few months, and until I start seeing change, I like to just keep saying the same thing, hoping that some folks listen. So hopefully if you've heard some of this before, it touches you in a different way, or you hear it in a different way. With that, let me share my screen and we can get started. All right. So at the intersection, racism and transportation, what are we talking about today? I am a person who likes very clear expectations. I like folks to tell me what they expect from me when they expect it, and I I like to do the same. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and what I do and how I got to this place of being called a planner, if that's what I am. And then, I used to just talk a lot and say a lot about all the problems there were. And then people started saying, could you give some concrete tips? Could you leave us with something? And so I'll talk a little bit about what folks can do who want to do this important work. Um, and if, again, at any point you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. Even if I'm not able to answer them as we go, I will definitely take a look at it afterwards. So with that, who am I? My name is Tamika, and the thing I like to say about myself is I love to bike. Biking is really what's brought me to this transportation space ever since I was a kid. And I just had this feeling of freedom every time I got on my bike. I still feel that freedom when I get on my bike. Despite being a person who's just like a big bike nerd and loves bike, I don't often refer to myself as a cyclist. I have many identities. I'm queer. I'm gender nonconforming. I'm a Midwesterner. That's a big part of my identity. And I'm also a Black woman. And so biking is something I love to do. It's something that's brought so much joy to my life. I think those of us who know and love bikes know that bikes can literally take you anywhere, but it's not what defines me. It's just a part of my story. But I think for many of us who do planning related work, and particularly transportation related work, there's something about mobility and there's something about movement that just really speaks to us. And so where do I work? In July, I started my own consulting firm, Tamika Butler Consulting. Before that, I was a planner at Tool Design. I have many colleagues in Portland who I miss dearly. It was a great firm where I was able to be the California planning director and oversee our planning in California, but I was also the firm's director of equity and inclusion. And I did that for the whole company, all 17 of our offices here in the United States and in Canada. Once everything started with the pandemic, with social uprisings about Black folks continuing to die and the genocide against my people, some of the stuff that I had been doing on the side really blew up. And so I decided to start my own firm where I'm lucky to still be doing a lot of the same work I was doing at Tool with a lot of the same clients, but also being able to branch out and work with different clients that aren't just transportation related, whether or not that's a public health department or whether or not that's a museum. Now, am I a planner? That's something folks always ask me. And to answer that question, I really think about where it came from. As I said, being a Midwesterner is a big part of my identity. I grew up in Okinawa, Japan. My dad was in the Air Force. But right before I started high school, and my dad said, where do you want to live? I have a sheet, I get to fill it out. And my sister and I were like, California, Hawaii, Florida. And he came home and he said, well, we're moving to Omaha, which wasn't on our list. But my mom and dad actually grew up in Omaha. Dad has 14 brothers and sisters, grew up in the projects there. Right around the corner from the birthplace of Malcolm X. And that's where we had roots. And so when we moved back for high school, it's ultimately where I went to college. And I went to Creighton University. And I didn't go to Creighton because there are a lot of gay Black kids on Catholic university campuses. But I went to Creighton because in some respects, that's all my family could afford. I got a scholarship. But beyond that, I was really shaped by this experience. It taught me a lot about being a person of service and being for and with other people. But I remember when I graduated, I was like, I'm too Black, I'm too gay. I can't live in the Midwest. I have to go to a coast. And so when it was time to apply to law school, I ended up going to Stanford. The small town Nebraska girl in me thought I was going to the gay Mecca in San Francisco. I didn't realize that Palo Alto and San Francisco are very different. And I didn't realize that even though I was from Nebraska, living in San Francisco often meant seeing fewer Black folks than I saw in Nebraska. But nonetheless, after I graduated from law school, I got a job. I got a fellowship, a legal fellowship that about 25 people a year get, where you get to start your dream project, do anything you want to do. And so I wanted to start a workers' rights clinic in the historically Black neighborhoods of San Francisco, Bayview, Hunters Point, and the Western Addition. And when I went to open up my legal clinic in Bayview Hunters Point, I really struggled to get clients. Part of it was the young 20-something me. I didn't look like what folks thought a lawyer should look like. But the other reason was is because SFMTA had just started a new muni line that went to Bayview Hunters Point, and people were pissed off about it. They didn't think it was for them. Bayview Hunters Point, for folks who don't know San Francisco well, used to be where Candlestick Park was. That's where the San Francisco 49ers used to play before they moved to San Jose. And many people in the community felt like this muni line was just to bring people in and out from the game, not to serve them, not to get them closer to the city core, to the center. People felt like no one talked to them about stops, about timing. Like the community wasn't planned with, they were planned against. And like it was not for them, it was for other people who could just bypass them. And so for me, this legal job I had was really my first introduction to the way that transportation is really this prism for which we should see all other social justice issues, right? People wanted to talk about access to jobs, our healthcare, our education, but they couldn't talk about those critical social justice issues without talking about, again, how they were going to get there and what the T line meant for them. When I ultimately decided that being a lawyer wasn't for me and decided to become a recovering lawyer, I moved down to LA and I worked at a foundation where I oversaw the Boys and Men of Color program and the education portfolio and the LGBT portfolio. It was like a dream job as a gay, queer person doing gay and queer things at a foundation that was focused on funding community organizations at the front line doing community organizing. But in this job, I experienced some discrimination at work, and I was really beaten down. It really, really took a huge toll on me, and I didn't know what I wanted to do next. I was, someone who still loved riding my bike. I had just done a bike ride from San Francisco to LA. And I had a friend, the same friend who had introduced me to my wife and who had convinced me to do AIDS Life Cycle, reached out and said the LA County Bicycle Coalition is hiring. You should apply. And I was like, you haven't gone, wrong yet on your advice, but I don't know. And I remember looking at the website and thinking, I don't know if I can do this job. It's a lot of white people. Bike lanes are the first sign of gentrification. I don't know that I can do this, right? And then I had another friend from San Francisco, a woman of color, Linda Liu, who had worked with me at a public health organization. And she said, you have to apply for that bike coalition job. And I was like, how do you know there's a bike coalition job in LA? She was a member of the San Francisco Bike Coalition because everybody seems to be a member of the San Francisco Bike Coalition. And she just really pointed out that, as a public health professional, she wished there were more people doing transportation work that saw the intersection with housing, saw the intersection with public health, saw the intersection with climate change, and really, really pushed me / guilted me into applying for the position. I went to a Catholic school, as I said, so I understand guilt very well. At work, I applied, and I didn't think I was going to get the job. As I sat in the interview and I looked at this board of mostly white men, they said, we've asked you all our questions. Is there anything you want to say? And I said, yeah, like I'm a queer woman of color. And that's the way in which I see all of my work. And so if you don't want this to be a social justice and racial justice organization, don't hire me. So I was surprised when they hired me. I was not the only one who was surprised. That slide does say, we see white smoke rising above the downtown headquarters of LA County Bicycle Coalition. That is a reference to the Pope. The bike community, those of us who are in bike communities know the bike community is often small. People had no idea who I was. They didn't know what to expect. They didn't even know if I was a real cyclist. They found this picture on my Facebook and they're like, oh, well, she rides a bike. But no one really knew what to expect. But one thing I will say about the Bike Coalition is it opened up my world to urban planning, a profession I didn't really understand before. It was like pulling back a curtain and being like, what? White folks know about this? They're planning our neighborhoods, they're planning our bike lanes, and no one told me. But beyond that, beyond falling in love with the subject matter, it was literally the best job I ever had. It was hard not to have the smile on my face every single day when I got to ride my bike, and when I got to wear shirts this wrinkled and no one cared. Beyond that, when I was at the Bike Coalition, we helped LA become a Vision Zero city. And we did it with this diverse coalition. There were folks in our coalition who were at a neighborhood land trust. There were folks at a community public health organization. There was a youth organization that focused on getting youth engaged and voting. There was a racial justice organization that focused on police oversight and police reform. Despite the fact that there were people who were part of walking and biking organizations, we were a coalition led by diverse people who said Vision Zero to become a reality can't just focus on enforcement. And that's before it was sexy to do and everyone was doing it. I also got to be at press conferences all the time with the mayor, who some people think might be the next Secretary of Transportation. I was around for the launching of Bike Share in LA County. And this is a few years ago. This was actually before the election 4 years ago. We were out on Halloween passing out M&Ms, asking people to vote yes on this measure, which when it passed was the first transportation measure that wouldn't ever sunset and allocated money specifically for active transportation, biking and walking. It was like a dream come true. I had this job that was amazing. I couldn't have written it any better. And I was in Hollywood. And so I also got to do cool things like ride my bike to the Emmys, ride up with the guy all the way on the left, a producer for Mad Men. He got us tickets into the award show. And I got to go in and actually be part of a Hollywood dream. And so it was this awesome job until it wasn't. I lived in a district where we had a council member who there was a bike lane that had been approved. And when he came into office, he decided that he didn't want the bike lane, that he wanted to start the community engagement process over. And people kept dying. And it wasn't just people biking, it was people walking. It wasn't safe. The crosswalk and the light signaling, nothing was safe. The road needed to be rethought. I remember after my honeymoon, after marrying my wife, we were sitting outside at a restaurant eating in our neighborhood, and we heard a loud crash and we turned, and a woman had been hit and she ultimately died. And that was what really propelled this candidate to pursue a city council position. And people in the bike world were ecstatic. This is a person who owned a bike shop, who was a bike dude. And folks really felt like he was going to be the change in our community. The folks who weren't excited, people like me, women of color who had interacted with this dude and knew that he never treated us well. So it wasn't a surprise to us when the dark interwebs showed that he had been on calling people the N-word, saying that fat people deserve to be raped because they make bad decisions, that transgender people just need to make up their mind. None of this was surprising to us and none of this was okay. But what ended up happening in that very small bike community, which I loved and which I was a part of, is that all of a sudden people started coming out one by one and saying, he may have said these things, but he's going to get me a bike lane, so we should still vote for him. And all of a sudden there was a lot of pressure on me as the head of the bike organization to endorse him from funders, from staff, from people in the community. And I just couldn't do it. And I think for me, oftentimes we all like to sit around, especially with everything that's happening in the country now, and we like to say, I can't believe you can excuse some of this behavior just because you might get something you want. I would speak up if I was in that position. But the reality is when we're in the transportation space, there are a lot of things that we don't speak up and we don't say if we're going to get what we want, if we're going to get that bike lane. And so for me, I became this person who folks said, well, why wasn't I talking about biking more? All of a sudden, all I wanted to talk about was race. And even after I left the Bike Coalition, when they were hiring new leadership, they told some people in their interviews, well, we don't want you to talk about race as much as Tamika because that's all she did. She didn't really talk about bikes, which isn't true. I just told you all the things I did about bikes, and that's a small fraction. But people just felt like I just needed to shut up and focus on bikes and not talk about race. And the thing I would hear all the time is, well, bikes don't discriminate against people. Why do you have to talk about this? And folks are absolutely right. Bikes don't discriminate against people, but cyclists, they discriminate against people. This is a short plug. If you haven't seen the issue of Bicycling Magazine where we covered the stories of amazing Black folks who bike, there are a lot of ways in which we talk about the fact that you can't talk about bikes without talking about race. That when you are doing planning work, when you are doing transportation work, whether or not it's bikes, whether or not it's transit, whether or not it's cars, you can't talk about transportation and not talk about race. You want us to just shut up and bike? You want us to just shut up and talk about transportation? Well, that's not really an option. The only option is that you have to constantly be talking and thinking about race and racism. But the reality is, for many of the folks who hold power in this profession, in this industry, right, that's not an option that they're interested in. They don't want to talk about race. They don't want to talk about these things. And that's just so baffling to me, because the question I always have is, why do we do this work? Why do we go to work? Why do we get interested in planning and transportation? And one of the things I like about this field, one of the things I loved about urban planning when I discovered it after being a lawyer, is I found like I found my people. I found like everyone I met in planning and transportation, even architecture and our little area of the world, we do this work because we want to help people. We want to make things sustainable and beautiful, and we want to create places. We don't just want people to go to a thing. We want people to feel like they're in a place, right? And we want folks to feel the comfort to be able to be mobile or to be able to stay in place, right? And so for me, that's why I go to work. I go to work for my family and my son. I'm raising a Black kid, and I want him to know that his mobility is always going to be a challenge because he's a Black man. But I also want him to know that there is joy in that and there is fun in that. And that, I may be an expert on transportation equity, but more than anything, I'm just someone who loves my wife. I'm just someone who loves my kid. And I just want to make a better world for them. And I just think that, like, a lot of times when I'm in planning spaces, when we're able to do conferences like this in person, it feels like we're all on the same page. But again, every time you try to say, okay, great, we're all on the same page, so let's talk about racism, let's talk about anti-Blackness, all of a sudden, folks you thought were on the same page, who you thought all had a common goal, start to question it. And these are things we have to talk about now more than ever, because we are in a place where our country is facing two major crises, right? There are two pandemics ravaging this country, COVID-19 and systematic racism. And it feels like we're living in two different worlds, where some of the folks in our profession are really concerned with making sure that people can have their boozy brunches. And some of us are out in the streets every single day, just asking for folks to see us, just asking for folks to see us as humans and respect our dignity. And too often there are folks who are like, well, I'm the transportation person, so I'm only here to talk about transportation. Or I'm the housing person, so I'm only here to talk about housing. We've set up this industry where we're in these silos, and we go and we talk to people who we say we want to help, but then we tell them we're only there to talk about a single issue, and that's not really how the world works. Because for many of us, we can't really identify with those single issue struggles because we don't live single issue lives. And again, this has been going on for a long time. When it comes to transportation specifically, Black and Brown folks have always known that transportation was a spot where folks were hunting us down, right? Using a fare evasion to make sure that they could get us. And when people say they don't want to talk about racism and transportation, I say, why? From the very beginning, civil rights and anti-Blackness and transportation and racism and white supremacy, they've always been intrinsically tied. Ever since Miss Rosa said, nah, homie, not today, racism and talking about racism and transportation has been key. And it's not just transportation, it's our criminal justice system. It's the way we zone our communities. Where can there be industrial pollution? How does that impact residential mobility? Where is there environmental racism in toxic communities? Where are there people feeling like their neighborhoods are literally killing them, right? And what about our schools? What about the segregation? And the one that many of us in planning know about, what about redlining, right? This is a great book. If you haven't read the book, read it. I like it. I like the author. I've been on panels with him. But the thing I think folks don't like to acknowledge about our profession is that it's super white centered. The subtitle of this book, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, forgotten to who? Too often in our profession, we say, well, we've just never thought about things like this. Well, there's this forgotten history and we just didn't know about it. Who's the we? Because for Black and Brown and Indigenous folks who don't have generational wealth to pass down, We haven't forgotten about the history of redlining. We haven't forgotten that we're in a white-centered space. And again, this is more pressing now than ever because this virus is killing us. It's hard to talk to Black folks, Indigenous folks, Brown folks. It's hard to talk to us without hearing that we know somebody who was lost to this virus. I lost a friend from college. It's hard to talk to us without us saying we know somebody who's still showing up at work every single day that doesn't have the privilege to sit behind a screen and be on Zoom. My mom, my sister, right? We know those folks. And even though I will never watch this video of a man gasping for his last breath and calling out to his dead mother while somebody puts their knee on their neck, I have seen this picture and I know, I know that that green bike lane behind him wouldn't have saved his life. Because I know when you are Black and you can't walk in your own neighborhood and eat Skittles, or you can't have somebody say, it's a pandemic, it's 2020, times are stressful, just get out and take a run. And you can't even take a run in your own neighborhood without knowing that your Blackness could mean that it's your last run. I worked at a bike coalition. I know a plenty of white bike bros who see cops who pull them over and say, you don't know the law, and get in the cop's face. And they don't have to worry about losing their lives. Meanwhile, there's Black men who get stopped for bicycle infractions and never make it home. I have been working like crazy, just like a ton of Black folks during the last few months. All of a sudden, equity in transportation is sexy. And now everybody wants us to be on this panel, that panel, do this thing, do that thing. And we do it because this work is important. Our life depends on it. But we want folks to recognize our brilliance. We want folks to know who we are. We want folks to remember our name. We want to leave a lasting impact. We want to help transform this work that is so important to us. And we want to be remembered for what we contributed, not just because we're another name on a list. Imagine being Black and never knowing if the reason people are going to know your name is because you're another trending hashtag. And yet and still we expect our colleagues and our students, we expect them to continue to show up, right? Just get on Zoom. We ask that cursory question, how you doing? Oh yeah, things are tough. Anyways, did you meet that deadline? Did you finish that project? Did you do that thing? And for so many of us, we're just not okay. And I always give the seizure warning on this slide because that's how it feels to be Black in this space right now, to be a person of color, to be part of an oppressed or marginalized group. You just keep saying you're not okay, but it doesn't feel like anyone cares. And still, again, those folks who have historically held power, they just want us to stop talking about race. It's just too much. They'd rather just sit at their computer nicely, log into Zoom, and not have to hear this, because when they hear it, it makes them want to pull their hair out. And they just keep saying, but I'm not racist. Why do we have to talk about this? Just stop, because it's a lot. But as I've already said, it was a lot before a pandemic. It was a lot before George Floyd. The reality is, people who are saying, I just didn't know before, you have to ask yourself, how didn't you know? How weren't your eyes open? Because if you operated with your privilege, thinking that because something wasn't a problem for you, it wasn't really a problem, then maybe that's why you're just opening your eyes. It doesn't take one Black man being killed. It's not one president. It's not one person who makes things this bad. These things were already here. It's just some folks chose not to listen to us. Some folks chose not to do anything to see it because they didn't have to, because it didn't impact them. But now all we're saying is stop killing us. That's all we want. When you're going to do your transportation work, you still have to think about how you're going to stop killing us. And people are like, but this is so overwhelming. How do I do that? What am I supposed to do? I'm just one person. And I say, first, you have to understand the difference between diversity, equity, and inclusion, because people are using those words interchangeably right now. and they're not the same thing. This is diversity. When you think of diversity, think of 90s clip art, right? Like, is that a religious minority? Throw them in there. Is that an older adult? Make her laugh. Wheelchair? Put that person in the front. Women? Sprinkle the women liberally. Well, is that a white guy? Put him in the back. Make him pretend it's hard to see, right? That's diversity. It's just having as many diverse faces as you can at the table. That is not the same as inclusion. And if we ever want to get to equity, we have to understand inclusion. And inclusion requires that you talk about power. It requires that those who have had it relinquish it. And that is hard for people. You can have a diverse organization, you can have a diverse program, you can have a diverse classroom, you can have a diverse neighborhood that isn't inclusive. For something to be inclusive, people like to believe it's this one-on-one level thing of like everyone feels welcome here. But everyone feeling welcome is like, like I said, one-on-one level. And if 2020 has taught you nothing, it's that we're not at the one-on-one level anymore. True inclusion is those folks who are diverse, who you've brought to the table, they actually have a voice. They actually have some power. They can set organizational culture. They can say yes or no to things. They can determine where resources are going. That's what inclusion is, that there has been a shift in who has power. And when we talk about equity, this is the picture that everybody likes to think of. And if you're like me and you're a visual person, this is helpful, right? You give everybody the same thing, that's equality, and they might not actually be able to see. But you give folks what they need, meaning that some folks may get nothing at all, and that's equity. But if you learn nothing else from this talk, stop using this picture. It's not the reality of where we really started. And it also doesn't get to what we should be fighting for in the end, which is liberation. Like I said, transportation has always been tied to the experience of Black folks, right? From the moment we were put on ships. And so since my ancestors were enslaved and brought here, I've been trying to get free. Black folks have been trying to get free. And that's why I do transportation work, because transportation and mobility liberation is what I do this for. I want folks to be able to get to the places and people and resources that they need and love freely and with dignity. But the other reason I don't like this picture, even this version of the picture, is because it doesn't talk about power. And what I already said when I was telling you about inclusion is we have to talk about power. I live in LA. We really like baseball right now. And so maybe this is a fine picture to me, but the invisible fence in this picture is power. Someone still determined that what we want to do is watch baseball. But what if you don't like baseball? What if you love baseball, but you want to play? What if you want to coach the team? What if you want to own the team? What if you don't like baseball at all, but you're just a business person and you want to have the exclusive contract to sell peanuts at the stadium? At some point, for true liberation, we have to believe that the folks who we say we're trying to help have some power, and we have to let them self-determine what they want, right? We have to really understand that as an individual, I can say I feel empowered, but I have to stop saying that I want to empower others. Empowering others is something we should wipe from our vocabulary because it is colonial. It is no less colonial than the people who came here and say they settled, they discovered, right? Because who are we to say we have the power and only we have the power and only we have the power to bestow it upon others? Instead, we have to realize that as a profession, we often think about power as something you hold over people. I'm from the Midwest, so I love Kanye West. Old Kanye, not new Kanye. New Kanye, we don't talk about. But old Kanye had this song, Power, where he said, no one man should have all that power, right? And that's how we all think about power. We think about it as something that you can have and then hold over people. But again, if we get away from that empowering mindset and we think about powering with people, if we think about how we co-power folks, that totally changes the game. We also have to get to a place where we start getting way, way more comfortable talking about racism. No one wants to be called a racist. And because no one wants to be called a racist, we don't talk about racism. But the reality is, I'm not saying everybody discriminates, but everybody has those thoughts sometimes that are racist. I'll never forget the first time I moved to LA and needed to go to the doctor. And I asked my wife if she could give me a rec. And she said, go to my doctor. And I go to the doctor and she walks in and it's a Black woman and I'm shocked. And I say to my wife, why didn't you tell me she was a Black woman? And she says to me, why did you assume she wasn't? We've all been in situations like that. We're on an airplane and the pilot's voice comes on and it's a woman. And we're like, oh, there's this Black reporter on NPR. And every time I hear her voice, I'm taken aback because that's not what I expect to hear on NPR, right? And it's not because I'm a racist person, but it's because I grew up in a society that is steeped in racism. And if I can't say that out loud, if my wife can't call me out on that and then call me in, we can't have that conversation and I can't realize it. We're so afraid to talk about racism because we don't want to be called racist, but we can't fix a problem we won't name. And we can't really get to anti-racism if we're not talking about racism, right? And an anti-racist is someone who actually takes action. You have to constantly be self-aware and self-critical and self-examine. And you have to make a choice to do something about it. Because too often when we think of white supremacy, we think of white hoods or tiki torches. And we have to start realizing that white supremacy is a culture. It's the way in which we exploit and oppress groups of folks for the sole purpose of maintaining and defending the systems of wealth and power that we have. We have privilege and we don't want to let it go. And we can't say, well, a white supremacist is that person because white supremacy isn't the shark. It is literally the water. It is the thing we swim in. It is all around us. And so if we truly, truly want to make individual change, there are a few things that you have to think about. You have to force yourself to understand that difference, that not being racist isn't the same as being anti-racist. You have to ask yourself, why are you so afraid to be brave and to really confront these things? I talked about things that are white centered. How are you going to start decentering whiteness? Ask yourself that every single day. How am I going to decenter whiteness and realize that just because I haven't experienced something doesn't mean it's not true? How do I force myself to think about racism and white supremacy every day? So instead of saying, Tamika, why are you always talking about racism? How do I make it so that I'm always talking about racism, right? And what am I doing every single day to stop the killing of Black people? Because this isn't just a moment in history, this has to be a movement. And we have to be on a journey. I'm a transportation planner, so I like to talk about trips. I like to talk about journeys. And that journey starts as someone who fakes it until you make it. Maybe you don't understand why people are saying older adult instead of seniors. Maybe you don't understand why people are saying people with disability instead of that person's disabled. Maybe you don't understand why it's not a funny joke to say, I'm going to vote for the person who doesn't need support to walk down the stairs. Maybe you don't understand why that's ableist. Maybe you don't know what ableist is, right? Maybe you don't understand why somebody wants they, them pronouns, but you know it's the right thing to do. So you just fake it until you make it. And sometimes that's all you can ask for. Just fake it until you make it. But at some point, you have to start really asking yourself, what does ableist mean? I don't know. I have to figure it out. Why is this person telling me it's not preferred pronouns, it's just pronouns? I don't know what that means. I need to figure it out. If you don't take the time to actually figure out why you're doing the things you do, then you're going to be no better than Mel Gibson. Great actor. Look at him. He wins awards. Horrible person, though. Says he wants his pregnant partner to get raped by a gang of N-words, uses anti-Semitic remarks. And that's the thing. If you don't ever truly integrate why you're doing the things you're doing, why you're trying to make this change, then at some point you'll be caught. At some point it will be on surface that you were just acting. You were just doing what you thought you had to do. And you have to get past just going through the motions so that you can become an ally. And that's where you realize that an ally isn't just a noun, it's about doing something. It's about taking action, taking a stand. But again, 2020 is not a one-on-one year anymore, and being an ally is great, but what we really need are accomplices. We need co-conspirators. We need folks who are willing to lose something. Because I guarantee if you are queer, if you're a person with a disability, if you are Indigenous, if you are Black, and you are in this profession and you are speaking up and you are speaking out, you're risking something. Maybe your professor doesn't like you. Maybe you're risking advancement. Maybe you're not going to get that job. People see you coming and they're like, oh, there's Tamika again talking about racism. And so an ally might be in a meeting where that woman speaks up and it's crickets, and then a man says the same thing and everybody's like, that's amazing. An ally will go to that woman afterwards or send her an email and say, hey, I just wanted you to know, like, I know you said that first. I don't know why people didn't get that. I appreciate that you're a part of this team. But an accomplice will say that in the meeting. An accomplice isn't going to be afraid that everybody's going to group them with that person who's the other. An accomplice knows that they might have to give up some of their power, some of their influence, some of their likability to make change. And the thing about this journey is it's not some mountaintop you get to. There might be certain issues where you're an accomplice and other issues where you're just an ally. There might be days where you just don't have anything else to give, and so you're only acting. But you have to always be moving forward, because only when we move forward can we make institutional change. People make up institutions, people make policies, people make systems. So we need people to change, but we also need those people to then change the institutions. We have to create brave spaces in our institutions where you are not afraid to be vulnerable. We have to get away from thinking we have to have safe spaces where we have to be comfortable. As a Black genderqueer woman, I never feel safe. I never feel safe when I'm in rooms full of white people, but I can be brave. I can be my authentic self. And so if you have the privilege where you don't have to be brave every day, how are you going to force yourself to be brave when you're having these conversations, to be vulnerable, to hold yourself accountable, to make mistakes? If you're doing this right, you will make mistakes, but then you keep trying. You acknowledge the limitations of your own expertise, and you hold space for past harm. Then you can start questioning power and privilege. You should always be asking yourself, if you're starting a new program or initiative, or you have an idea, who is going to be most impacted by the decision that's made? And then ask yourself, were they at the decision-making table? Did they have a say? And if they didn't, then you know the power dynamics are off. Then you have to question the privilege of the folks who got to be at the table. Why? What data was accepted? Why did we think this person who's a consultant is an expert and worth $500 an hour, but this person who sits out on their stoop every single day and knows this neighborhood better than anyone isn't? Who are we privileging? Who are we giving power to? And when we start thinking about these things every day, when we start being conscious of our journeys, then and only then can we truly appreciate the intersection of transportation and racism. And we can understand that that intersection never ends. It's not always going to be safe. It's not always going to be comfortable, but it is going to be essential. We have to talk about these issues. We have to talk about racism. We have to talk about anti-Blackness, because we are not doing our best transportation work if we don't. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It looks like we have one question. I'm hoping we can go through the first question, the Q&A, and hopefully other people will be filling in anything and everything that they can think of. So I'll read off the question here. The question is from Corey. How can cities and planners advocate for better equity within pandemic policies when trying to be inclusive of people of color groups right now? For instance, a city has been looking to partner with more people of color organizations. This past Saturday, we held a racial justice bike ride to highlight local racial/climate disparities and celebrate the new bikeway infrastructure here. However, as a way to attempt contact tracing, the city requested volunteers, who were primarily women and people of color, to provide personal cell phone numbers to the public ride. After some back and forth, they had a city employee provide her with information. While we eventually figured it out, it made me really think about how other pandemic policies could be incidentally exclusionary.
Yeah. One of my dear friends and colleagues, Naomi Dorner, who used to work and do equity work for the Seattle Department of Transportation and is now the head of equity, diversity, and inclusion at Nelson Nygaard, fairly early on in the pandemic, when slow streets were the rage, she sent out a tweet that said something about, like, if I'm in one more Zoom where folks talk about taking advantage of this opportunity, like, I'm gonna take myself off mute so they can hear my scream, right? And I think what happened during this pandemic is that all of a sudden a lot of places got creative. And I think that's only continued, especially as we've seen the economic ramifications of this pandemic, where we have to get creative with how we spend our resources. And so as that's happened, different ideas came up. And I think it's not just in transportation, it's on college campuses, right? If you were a student with a disability in the past, you'd be asking for all these accommodations, and universities would be like, oh, we can't do that. We can't do that. Pandemic happened. It's like, we can do it. We can do it for everybody, because all of a sudden it's impacting more people, right? Not just the people who are the most vulnerable, but people who have more influence, who have more of a voice. And so I think we're seeing the same thing in transportation. We're seeing these programs, whether or not it's slow streets or sidewalk dining, the new one for places that experience winter, they have these domes on sidewalks that people can eat in, and that's okay because you have money to pay to eat in a tent. But if you are experiencing homelessness and you need a tent, then it's an eyesore, right? And so I think when we have cities who want to figure out how to integrate equity better, one, I think it's starting to ask yourself, when you're doing equity work, who are the groups that this can impact, and who's going to be most burdened? And are those folks, are we sharing the burden? And then the question is, again, did we consult any of those people when we were making this decision? So even if it's something as simple as asking for phone numbers, did we talk to anybody who would be in this position about how it would feel? And so I think we feel the need to move quickly right now, but we can't move quick at the harm of excluding certain people and not being more thoughtful. And we have to not just think about the fact, well, now this is impacting all of us, so let's just do what's good for the folks with the most privilege. We have to still really center those folks who need us the most.
Before I get to Gareth's question here, we do have another question from the chat. Let me read it real quick here. It's very simple. How do we start in a place like Eugene, which is so predominantly white? I sent you some materials about the context that we are in here. For those of us in Eugene and Oregon at large, it's a very strong history of white supremacy, KKK, very unacknowledged. As an Oregonian who grew up in Oregon, I didn't know about any of this until about 3 years ago, probably.
Right.
I would love any thoughts, or we all would love any thoughts that you have on that.
Yeah, when I worked at Tool, one of my jobs was to travel to every office and do an equity training. And so before I went to every location, I learned a ton about the place. And I remember doing a ton of research on Oregon and being like, yo, this place is crazy. Like the things that have happened here, and the way that you have, at least in popular culture, especially, when people think of Oregon, they think of Portland. And so they think of, the super liberal hippy dippy place, and that's not what the history is. I think it is sometimes harder to do the work in predominantly white spaces, but I think that's why it's also important. Sometimes when I share that picture of my wife, I tell a story about how we decided to raise our son as a young Black man, right? Like, we're both like super like liberal queers. And so we had this long conversation of raising him without a gender. And ultimately, we decided that would be irresponsible because the world was going to see him as a Black man. And if we didn't prepare him for that, then we weren't doing him a service as parents. Now, certainly he can grow up and tell us something different, but we need him to know what the world is going to see him as. And once we made that decision to raise him as a Black man together, my white wife didn't get to say, you got that right because you're the Black one. I don't know anything about being Black. And so what I say is to folks who ask, how do we do this in a context that is predominantly white? I think we still need white folks to do the work, right? Just because there might not be as many folks of color around. And the reality is there are folks of color there, right? Like, and we all know that, like, we've all been in situations. Palo Alto was the same way. But you know what? The folks who like did the groundskeeping at Stanford and worked in the dining facilities and did all of these things, they might have come in on buses, but they were still a part of our community. And so I think white folks have to realize that folks of color didn't create the system of white supremacy. And so we're like, I'm never gonna bet against us. Like, as folks of color, like, we can dismantle the system, but for it to be truly sustainable and for it to happen at a better pace, we need white folks to be participants. And that's why I think even if it feels like there's no one, it doesn't seem like there's people around who we can defer to or who can lead this or who might be impacted by that, you still have to think about it. Just because there's no one in your group who has a disability, we should still be thinking about whether or not sidewalk dining is accessible. And so folks who aren't part of the group have to do the work.
Great. I want to thank Gareth for reading my mind. The next question from him is, what do you think about the intersection between bike lanes and gentrification? How much should we worry about pricing people out of the neighborhoods we're trying to serve with better infrastructure? And any thoughts you might have about how to compensate for those inequalities?
Yeah, I shared with some folks earlier that one of the things that I've been considering during the pandemic is whether or not I want to go back to grad school and get a PhD. And one of the questions I really want to look at are like bike lanes and gentrification, because I feel like a lot of us who care about equity, we have some sense that there is a relationship there. But whenever you try to raise that, particularly in the professional context, you often hear, well, where's the research? That's just your opinion. And what I always like to say is, it's not that folks of color don't like bike lanes, right? Like I always say, Black folks invented bike share, right? Like, homie, let me hold your bike for a minute. I'm gonna bring it right back. And then everybody in the neighborhood's riding the same bike, right? So it's not that we don't like bikes. It's not that folks who are immigrants who come from other countries didn't ride bikes in other countries way more than we do here. So it's not a lack of people liking bike lanes. It's more about, is there a built trust? And do folks feel like this is something that's for them? So just like I talked about the example with the Muni line in San Francisco, when all of a sudden a bike lane just shows up and no one's talked to anybody, or folks are like, but we've been riding bikes. We've been working the graveyard shift at the restaurant and riding our bike home, and you never wanted a bike lane before. Why do you want a bike lane now? And so it's more about the fact that there are folks who are saying our neighborhoods have been neglected for years. You're building a bike lane and I don't even have streetlights that work. I don't have a grocery store, or we've been biking forever. Why do you care now? And so I think when we do transportation work, particularly mobility work, we have to think about how to move people, but we also have to think about how we keep people in place, right? Because our indigenous history tells us that we like to push people off of place, but how do we keep people in place? And often if you can build trust with community and they feel like you're planning with them, not against them or for someone else, that helps with many of those conversations.
We have a question from Todd here. He asks, what recommendations do you have for neighborhood transportation equity groups that struggle just to get complete streets and safe streets advanced, but don't have Black, Indigenous, people of color / non-white input involved in our predominantly white neighborhood partnerships, question mark, and also outreach to underrepresented neighbors?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is we have to be really thoughtful, and I think we have to change some of our mental constructs that are just inherent in our profession. We have to understand, first of all, that there's a difference between outreach and engagement, right? Outreach is often just going out to folks and saying, here's what we're going to do. What do you think? But here's what we're going to do. Engagement is genuinely saying, we want to bring a bike lane in. What do you think? And having people push back and say, we do not want a bike lane. And then you can ask questions. Well, why don't you want a bike lane? Well, because I wouldn't feel safe on the street. I'd much rather ride on the sidewalk. Well, why don't you feel safe on the street? Well, because cars drive too fast, right? So you have to be open to going in and truly engaging in that back and forth. That's the first thing. I think the other thing is we have to rethink who we think of as experts. Again, I think there are many community members who have a lot to offer, but we don't treat them as experts. And because we don't treat them as experts, we don't value their time in the same way. So someone who is a consultant, my clients say to me all the time, we want your expertise on this. When are you available? Can we look at your calendar? What time works for you? And when I say things like, I have a 2-year-old, so I can't do anything after this time, they work things out for me. We have to treat community members the same way. One, we have to figure out ways to pay people for their expertise, to like literally for showing up and when we're engaging them. And two, what time are our meetings? Do we have food? What kind of food? Like, how do we bring people together? And how do we realize that there are OGs in every community that people respect, whether or not it has anything to do with transportation? People respect those folks. I always say, like, if you were trying to plan a bike lane in the town where Friday Night Lights was set, you would go talk to the football coach. Who cares if he likes bikes, but he is a person of influence. And so I think we also have to start realizing that we're not just coming into these new communities and discovering them, and there's not some structure. There's structure, there's an ecology, there's like an ecosystem, and we have to figure out how we're like jumping into it and how we plug in, not try to create something new.
We're coming to the top of the hour. We have 3 questions left. Are you up for 3 more?
Sure.
And then calling it? All right. Next question is from Ray. He serves on the Oregon City Transportation Advisory Committee. Due to policing and systemic racism issues, I am trying to convince the police chief to allow my committee to discuss policy changes and enforcing during traffic stops. The police chief keeps resisting my requests because he feels my committee should not discuss these policy changes. What strategies have worked in other cities to get police chiefs to discuss policy changes and enforcement during traffic stops?
Yeah, I'll try to answer this one a little faster, mainly because there's not a lot of proven stuff out there. Cities I would look to, LA has a council motion right now where they're trying to pass something. San Francisco just announced that they are going to have a unit that's paramedics and social workers. And so I think looking to what San Francisco did, Berkeley has an RFP out right now where they're considering consultants to change this policy in their city. And then I think, as many of us know, Minneapolis is looking at this for obvious reasons. And so I really do think that places have to start leveraging other places that are doing it. And I think when it comes to policing, this is really an inside outside game. I am someone who believes in abolishing the police. I will just say that. But I also am someone who says I'm not necessarily trying to talk about just abolishing the police. I'm trying to get people to focus on what aren't we spending money on, right? So we are spending a lot of money on police, but what aren't we spending money on that you can get people in your community like, yes, we should be spending more money on that. Well, where's the money going to come from, especially in an economic crisis? And I think that's how some of those conversations can go. But I would definitely look to those cities I mentioned.
Next one is from Grace. I'm curious about your thoughts on mobility justice / sustainability in smaller communities and rural areas where bicycles aren't always a feasible option and transportation is very underfunded.
Yeah, I think this is a question that's near and dear to my heart. Again, I'm from Nebraska. And so the context I live in now in a super urban place is not necessarily where I grew up or where my heart is. I think it's also why, as someone who is like a staunch bike advocate, I've never been one of those bike advocates who says, it's bikes versus cars, because we don't know people's situations and we don't know the community context. And so for me, first of all, it's not just about getting rid of cars. I think all of the things that I'm talking about when it comes to equity should be applied no matter the mode of transportation, right? And so in more rural areas, you might not be focused on a network, a transportation network of bike lanes. You might be focused more on recreational trails, but those conversations still have to include communities, right? You still have to engage. You still have to realize that oftentimes the trails are more accessible to some groups of people than other groups of people. And why is that? And why do some communities have to drive to get there, whereas other communities could ride to get there? And so I think for me, whether or not, what people always say to me is, what would your toolkit be? If you wanted to make transportation equitable, what's the toolkit you would have? And I always say, if that's the frame you're approaching it from, then you're truly not understanding equity, because a rural community is different than an urban community, than a Midwest community, than a community in the South. And so the real way to figure out what do you do in communities with different contexts is always to start by asking people. And that's the only thing that would be in the toolkit. Start by asking people, again, finding out who those community influencers are. Influencers, people think it's a new social media term. It's always been a term. Who are those influencers in the community, and how do you work with them and ask questions?
Right. Our last question of the evening comes from Amy. The South has historically been a crucible for racial issues and was at the heart of the civil rights movement. In spite of that history, there's still overwhelming disparities in public health, transportation, housing, and green space access. How do we begin to combat regressive policies in the South, where a lot of communities are majority Black, but the states themselves are conservative?
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of the exciting work is actually happening in the South. And so I think too often you know, folks have this image of the South. And something I will say is when I did that work for Tool, where I went to every office and did a training, our thought was, let's start on the West Coast offices, Seattle, Portland, LA, Oakland, because those folks are going to like buy into what we're saying about like being an organization that's trying to end white supremacy. But we might have harder conversations in our South Carolina office and our North Carolina office, right? And the reality was that's actually where folks were way more open to many of these conversations because it is a part of their history. And so they're not trying to ignore that it's a part of their history. And so I would actually say, I think there's some great work happening in the South. Charleston, South Carolina, the head of transportation is a guy, Keith Benjamin, a young Black guy. They're doing really, really cool stuff. And he's put out a lot about talking to folks in the South. Atlanta, there's an organization called Transformation Alliance, and it's a coalition of many groups, some transportation, some housing, where they're doing everything from talking about the Beltline and kind of some of the displacement that happened there and building soccer fields under train stations, right? So green space and bringing that together. So I think there's a ton of actually really, really interesting stuff happening in the South. I don't think we can ignore the racist history, and I don't think we can ignore the way, especially now with like voter suppression and things that are happening. But I would encourage folks to give it a second look because I actually think that's where some of the most innovative work is happening, some of the most under-resourced work, but some of the most innovative work, and where they have really figured out partnerships where you let the community and folks of color lead. And so it's really exciting work.
Okay, I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much. I want to thank you on behalf of LiveMove and the University of Oregon, and on behalf of our two co-presidents, Eliza and Claire, as well. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughtfulness. And yeah, I'm just very thankful that you did this for us.
Of course. Thank you to LiveMove for having me. You all are great. I enjoyed our conversation earlier. These were super thoughtful questions. And if I can ever help, folks know how to reach me. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on my website. And I'd be happy to chat.
Awesome. Thank you everybody for coming. We were so glad that you all turned out to our first event this year. Stay tuned for more.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you.
Bye.